everyone, Dr. Jason Old here, surfer, historian, world traveler, and your host of the Surfing Historian podcast. This season, we'll be diving deeper into the nuanced world of surfing and examining the historical, cultural, philosophical, and even scientific elements of the sport we're all stoked on. So let's paddle out together and ride through the world of academia. This episode is sponsored by Face Stuff. Face Stuff's an all-natural zinc-based product company from San Diego, California that uses ingredients that are safe for the ocean while also protecting and moisturizing your skin. So instead of soaking up nasty radiation like chemical sunscreens, Face Stuff helps your skin reflect it. I'm a big fan of Face Stuff and always have a canister on hand and ready to use. Check them out at face-stuff.com and use promo code STOKED15 for 15% off their incredible products. Joining me today from Paris, France is Dr. Jérémy Lemarié. Jérémy is an associate professor of sports management at the University of Reims in France. His research examines sports and tourism in the United States and in Polynesia. After conducting fieldwork in California and Hawaii for 3 years, he published a book on the commodification of Hawaiian culture through surf tourism. He's also published a number of journal articles on the professionalization of lifestyle sports and human nature interactions. As a professor, he's taught courses on management, marketing, tourism, sociology, history, and cultural anthropology at 8 universities. Among them, the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the Paris Sorbonne University, and the Paris Institute of Political Studies. For today's episode, Jérémy and I will be chatting about his work on surf tourism, marketing surfing, surfer activism, and solidarity within the global surf community. I'm super stoked to have you on to share this information with our listeners. I was supposed to connect with Jérémy in Vietnam at a tourism conference he was organizing, but couldn't make it. So it's awesome we've been able to carve out some time to chat for this episode. But before we get started, I want to personally thank you, Jérémy, as well as our listeners, for being part of this episode of the Surfing Historian.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, for your podcast. I appreciate you having me among many other scholars. You are now on season 2, and I think that's a great initiative.
Yeah, Jérémy, thanks. And I've been looking forward to having you on as well, of course. You along with all the other scholars that I brought on have helped inform my research. So, thank you for your work and thank you, of course, to all the other people you mentioned. But I want to get right on into your research on surf tourism, among a number of other things we're going to talk about today. But I have a quick and simple question just to kick this off. What to you is surf tourism? In other words, how do you define it?
All right, sure. So the most academic definition would be surf tourism, to me, involves traveling from one's primary residence to a destination where the travelers expect to ride waves with or without a surf craft. So now that definition, basically I borrowed part of it to the most well-known, best-known definition of tourism, generally speaking, which means you traveling, so moving through space in the first place, and there are already disagreement, like how far do you need to travel to be a visitors, right? So to me, it's not necessarily how far, it can be mostly how long, right? And that's up to debate as well. Like if let's say you drive 5 hours, you're going to catch wave, which is not your home break. You're basically, a tourist. You're going to surf for 2 hours and then you drive 5 hours back. This is, a 14-hour type of day. Well, are you a tourist or not? And to the opposite, you might just be, 2 hours away from the surf break, but you're going to rent an apartment or a house by the beach and you're going to drive 2 hours, stay there for a week, surf every single day and come back. So that's the hard part about surf tourism, really, is like who does fit in the definition and who does not. And I think as soon as it involves traveling, whether it's just for one day or whether it's for a week or longer than that. And I think an important aspect of it too is, are you a local? Meaning, like, is that break your home break or not? And sometimes I might just drive for half an hour and surf a different break, which is not mine. I mean, not mine or not where I used to surf. And then I kind of consider myself as a visitor. I gotta, pay respect to the locals and all. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's other scholars and colleagues of ours have written on localism. Lindsay Usher, who I've had on and is a friend, she's written on the idea of localism. And so yeah, that's probably to dive into that is a whole nother episode in and of itself. But yeah, thanks for defining or at least helping us understand what you mean by surf tourism. And I actually want to use that as a segue into an article you've published fairly recently. I believe it was 2022, organized lifestyle sports in Southern California. And I know we've talked about this before, and I've talked to a number of other colleagues about it. And in many respects, surfers tend to be fairly selfish, at least on the surface. And and I know this article you wrote really kind of digs into surfers and community and all that. And so,
Mhm.
what do you say to those who make that suggestion that surfers are, inherently selfish?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's so much to unpack. So let's start with like the beginning type of things. When I first started to read about lifestyle sports and surfing, at the time I was a master's student. That was 2008, and I've read major scholars, and many of one of them actually, as you know, is Belinda Whitten, which was in the UK at the time, and now she works in New Zealand, Waikato University. And I loved her work. Everything she's done, she's been so influential, and I think most of us know her. Whether you work on surfing, skateboarding, BMX, parkour, all these lifestyle sports. By the way, lifestyle sport is an interesting word because it tend to be more British, while in the US you hear more the name action sports. But let's say it's about the same thing. And yeah, one of the most uh, common claim was that surfers are individualistic, selfish. They just think about themselves. And the thing is, like, theoretically speaking, usually the theory would come from like postmodern approach of societies where we're in societies where people think more about their own freedom, their own achievement over the community, right? So that would be just a continuity of the development of modern and Western societies. And one thing that was like to me disturbing a bit is that when I started doing field work, so my very first field work was in California. I was in a surf club, in specifically in Long Beach. We're surfing in Huntington, and that surf club, everybody was surfing together, right? So that, and even when I interviewed these surfers, I say, "Well, would you surf alone?" And they say, "No, because if something wrong happened to me, there's no one is to take to bring me back to the beach or anything like that. So no, I want to be safe, and I feel safer with someone by me and someone that I know, who I know." And then I just kept, studying surf clubs over and over again. So one was the University Surf Club, the one of Long Beach, and then a surf club of like older surfer, what we call now silver surfers, the one who started in the 50s, 60s, and that was the Huntington Beach Longboard Crew. And then I spent another year studying surf club in San Diego, the surf club of the university again, UC San Diego, and then the Wind and Sea Surf Club in La Jolla, which is very famous, notably because Fernando Aguirre, the president of the International Surfing Association, is a well active member of the club. Anyway, and everybody that studied were the opposite of selfish, the individualistic. They were involved in non-profit organization, right? The club, the surf club. They were working a lot voluntarily to get the club up and running. They were doing fundraising. They were organizing events for people with disabilities, for minorities. So that was the opposite of being selfish. They were surfing together, and a bias of that thought is that, yeah, they're in a club, so by definition they would tend to be more, I don't know, community oriented or community based. But that was the facts, and these facts kind of reminded me that, oh, wait a minute, the whole idea of lifestyle sports being something that it is practiced out of clubs. That was one of the main claims. Like, oh, look at the traditional Western sport. You play football, you are in a club. You play tennis, you're in a club. But when you skateboard, you're not in a club. Except that if you look at the history of surfing, surf clubs started, and that's another story, but the very first surf club where people were not only paid to teach surfing, but gather at the community was at least 1905, and that was the Huinalu in Waikiki. And then the development of surfing in California and in Australia, for example, is based and happened thanks to clubs and to communities. So how come lifestyle sports become individualistic? And so that's what I tried to demonstrate here in that paper. Is that, well, wait a minute, the community of surfers is very broad and diverse. And yeah, if I study, which was mostly the population that was studied, young surfers, right? The young, the youth, who are like 15, 14, maybe 16 years old. They get a surfboard and they just learn on their own. Yeah, they might be, selfish and all, but it's just a stage of their life. But now we know, and there are recent studies coming out, that the majority of surfers are getting older and older. And if you would study these people who started surfing in the 50s, 60s during that big surf boom, now that huge population, they're all in like communities, clubs, and all, and by far not selfish.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, when as I've, in talking to people who say, surfers are selfish, I kind of think about the lineup itself. Inside the lineup, everybody wants that wave that's coming. And so I think maybe some of it, comes from that. But, one of the things, like I said, we've talked about this before, but even having said that, I've seen so many instances, and this is kind of almost to your point, really, but so many instances where if somebody gets injured or, as we saw with Mick Fanning's shark attack, someone, people were actually willing to put themselves in harm's way to
Right.
help a fellow surfer, a fellow competitor. So, it does seem that even if surfers can be selfish on the waves, let's say within the lineup or the surf space, there's something there's something about the community itself that does transcend, quote unquote, fighting for the wave. So yeah, I completely see where you're coming from, and like you said, those are the facts, and I'm grateful you put some effort into doing that research. And I found the article intriguing and really fascinating. But you mentioned something earlier, and I just like maybe some clarification before we get into, you mentioned also Hawaii and the surf clubs. I want to get into that too, because I know that's something you've written extensively about. But you mentioned action sport and lifestyle sport. Is there a difference at all, or is that just one place calls it action sport and one place calls it lifestyle sport? Or do you see a difference in those terms?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that fundamentally we're talking about the same thing, but it's just the tradition of each country, and especially, I would say, paradigm of the ways you see the development that changes. Meaning that when you are talking about lifestyle sport, you heavily refer to academia, right? To the opposite, sports, my bad, usually come from the business world. I'll give you one example. I was lucky enough to interview Doug Palladini, who was at the time vice president of Vans and then a second time president of Vans. And yeah, the whole vocabulary and the marketing aspect of surfing revolved around action sports. So I think it's more about where you're from, whether you're an academic or you are more in the business world. And then then we're not talking about the same thing. In the business world, you talk about a target, consumers. And so I think that's one of the main difference.
Okay, awesome. So really it's just a matter of, as you said, what the industry, right? If you're in academia, we like to, or you said Belinda Wheaton, for example,
Right,
who
right.
writes on this, lifestyle sports, whereas Vans and some of these other brands, the major brands that everybody knows when they think about surfing, action sport is more of a marketing, it's more
Right.
tailored to marketing. Okay. Yeah,
Which you can have in academia as well. I've read like some academic papers on surfing, but if the approach is more centered around marketing rather than your own psychological balance or your own relationship with the environment and the ocean, like blue spaces, right? Then I think that's the main divide.
Okay. Yeah, and I know, hopefully there's time to get into your work on, branding in terms of your research kind of falls in line with a lot of this. But I want to you mentioned Hawaii earlier and really the Hawaiian clubs of the early, turn of the century really.
Right.
Would you and it's sort of in line with those clubs, what could you give us a bit of a history of those clubs and what did they do? Were they just surf clubs? Were they also lifeguarding? Like
Right.
how did all this evolve?
Okay. So here, there's a lot to unpack. So first, these clubs, and that's research made by John Clark, by Isaiah Walker, Patrick Mother as well, and my own. So these clubs were first commercial enterprise, and the very first one, which very few people know about, is the Hui Pakakanaru, which it didn't last long, but it's a club that was created, if I recall well, in 1897, and the goal was just to give outrigger canoe surf rides to tourists, right? And then the native Hawaiian, who were canoe captains, were getting paid, and they were not employees of that club, right? They were actually usually independent contractors. Um, the Hui Pakakanalu, which was around under the management of William Dimon. Dimon died quite early, and I cannot find any record in the archives to what happened to that club. So between 1987 to 1905, there's kind of an empty historical blank, which I'm sure stuff happened. But in 1905, that's where, so there is no official record, but oral history said that that's the loose creation of the Hui Nalu. So the Hui Nalu, it's so much, it's so many things at different stages. So the Hui Nalu is supposed to be the first beach concession of the Moana Hotel, which was one of the major hotels, which still on actually on Waikiki right now, which is one of the first major hotel on Waikiki Beach. And by the hotel, you will have these what they call first Waikiki boys, and then Waikiki Beach boys, and then just Beach boys, where they were, native Hawaiian paid to give outrigger canoe rides, swimming lessons, surf lessons. They were doing massage and so on and so forth. They were just like, guys on the beach to make sure that the tourists have a great experience. And the thing is that by 1908, you have another club which most people know, which is the Outrigger Canoe Club, which is still on now, and we relocated a bit closer to Diamond Head now. And OCC was a club made by what we call Kama Ainais. So Kama Ainais are usually at that time, because now it has carries a different meaning, but at the time the Kama Ainais were Honolulu businessmen, mostly male, well-off politicians who were very interested in Native Hawaiian culture. Many of them enjoy watching the hula. Many of them enjoy, eating the traditional Hawaiian food, and they like the idea of like the primitive type of aspect of the Hawaiian culture that was disappearing after the overthrow of the monarchy and then the annexation by the U.S. So then that club, these Kama'ainas, founded the Outrigger Canoe Club, which was a non-profit club, mostly, exclusively actually for whites, for them to have beach access and to have surfboards and outrigger canoes on the beach, and then they could go out and enjoy as a leisure activity. Now it's tricky because quickly the Huinalu by 1911 didn't change, it broadened its purpose with Duke Kahanamoku winning the world record and beating actually the world record in 1910 in the port of Honolulu. As soon as Duke became world famous, even before he actually competed in the Olympics, right? Because he beat the world record by 4 seconds. I think it's 1911. Well, the Huinaru was created a few months after that, officially. So that's, you go to the Hawaii State Archive, you have the official records of the club, and notebooks, logs of the date of creation, who is a board member, who is a member, blah 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 blah. And that's where the Huinaru mostly is promoted as a amateur sports club to bring top athlete to the Olympics, right? So it's everything. And the Huinaru, now there's a confusion between the Huinaru, between that beach boy type of business, but also at the same time, the same name, officially registered, non-profit organization that brings the best athletes of Hawaii to the Olympics from 1912, and then the Olympic of 1920, 24, and so on and so forth.
Okay. By the way, you said 1987 when I think you meant 1897 earlier.
Oh, yeah, 1897. Thank you.
But
yes,
I'm pretty sure anyone listening is like, well, yeah, that's what he meant. So,
yeah, that's right.
But I just thought I would throw that out there just to, just in case anybody was confused. But yeah, I knew exactly what you were saying. But yeah, so it sounds like, the Beach Boys of Waikiki, right? Not the band when people think of that.
Right.
It really started as a way to cater to tourism. This, as you said, this white Western tourism, essentially, that started in and around that time. And then, of course, the Hui or the Beach Boys, and then, even as you said, the nonprofit the Hui, certainly as people like Duke became prolific swimmers, prolific surfers, world renowned, it shifted a bit away from catering to tourists and really focused on, I think you said, bringing in or even training local talent.
That's correct. But I think there is, like, on purpose. So you can see when you read newspapers and the archive at the time, there is an ongoing conflict between the Nuhuinalu swimmers and the swimmers from the mainland US and even from Australia, who were usually fourth or fifth during races after the first three were Huinalu members with Duke at the forefront. And there were many complaints that were sent to the AAU, the American Athletic Union, that these swimmers were paid for teaching swimming, meaning they were not amateurs, they were professional. And I think that's what happened. It's interesting because when you read newspapers, you read diaries of the tourists, you've seen Jack London is the famous story. You see all of these people talking about the Beach Boys on the beach, like, Duke teaching and before George Freeze. And but when you look at the record of the Huinalu, none of this is mentioned. And I think this is made on purpose. Like the Huinalu members, they had to do both. The tricky part is that as a amateur swimmer, you cannot, live off your activity. So you need a income. And these beach boys were best at, giving outrigger canoe rides, surface and swimming lesson, and also being like informal lifeguard. But at the same time, the tourist season in Waikiki was not running all year round. It was mostly during summer and winter. So it was kind of hard for them to have to be like a full-time beach boys because the tourists were at the very beginning at the time, but they could not neither be full-time amateurs. So depending on the sources where you look at, even they were very good at fundraising. So as if you look at the local newspaper, they are either great swimmers or great entertainers, giving representation, in Honolulu and raising funds to send the athletes. But if you read some of the archives written in Hawaiian or the diaries of the world-renowned tourists, then these same people end up being